I always knew my parents favored my sister, but I never thought they would go as far as to erase me from their lives entirely. Growing up, I learned to expect the little things, the way they doted on Olivia's every accomplishment while brushing aside my own, the way she always got the newest gadgets, the best clothes, and the undivided attention of everyone in the house. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment I realized that, in their eyes, I wasn't even worthy of a home. My name is Rebecca, and at 28 years old, I stood on the cracked asphalt of what was now legally my property, a parking lot sandwiched between a rundown gas station and an abandoned strip mall. The summer heat radiated off the pavement in waves, distorting the edges of my vision as I clutched the property deed in my trembling hands. Less than a mile away, Olivia was standing in the grand foyer of her newly gifted mansion, the marble floors gleaming beneath an imported chandelier while she graciously accepted the family's praise for doing absolutely nothing to deserve it. It all started a few months earlier when my parents sat me down to discuss the future of the family estate. I had always assumed, naively, that despite their favoritism, they would at least make an attempt to divide things fairly. After all, I was their daughter too. I had worked just as hard, if not harder, than Olivia to build a stable life for myself. I had put myself through college, taken out loans they refused to co-sign, and carved out a successful career in real estate investment without a single dollar of their financial support. Meanwhile, Olivia had coasted by on their generosity, hopping from one failed business venture to another, each time cushioned by the safety net of our parents' endless patience and deep pockets. The meeting was held in my father's study, a place I had rarely been invited into. The heavy scent of cigar smoke clung to the mahogany bookshelves, the overstuffed leather chairs, and the lingering sense of self-importance that my father carried wherever he went. My mother sat beside him, her pearl necklace gleaming under the dim lighting, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if this was nothing more than another routine social obligation. "We've decided to finalize the property distributions," my father announced, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made. "Your mother, and I believe it's time to start securing the family's legacy." I nodded, suppressing the unease that had already begun to settle in my chest. "That makes sense. What are the plans?" My mother glanced at Olivia, who sat across from me with a smug, expectant look that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. She already knew. She had known for a long time. "Olivia will be inheriting the main estate," my father continued, as if the words weren't enough to knock the breath from my lungs. "The house, the land, the assets attached to the property, all of it will be under her name." I blinked, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just said. "The entire estate?" My voice was steady, but my hands clenched into fists in my lap. "I thought the plan was to split things fairly." My mother's delicate sigh of exasperation made my skin crawl. "Rebecca, don't be dramatic. Olivia has always been the more domestically inclined. She's the one who will maintain the family home, host events, continue the traditions." I stared at her, dumbfounded by the sheer audacity of her words. "You mean she's the one who has never had to work for anything in her life? The one who has spent years burning through every opportunity you've handed her?" Olivia gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. "That's incredibly unfair, Rebecca. You know how hard I've tried." "Tried and failed," I muttered under my breath. My father's expression darkened. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice laced with that quiet authority that had dictated every aspect of my childhood. "You're not going to start causing problems now, are you?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Then what about me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, though the anger simmered beneath every word. "What am I getting?" My mother smiled, a soft, placating expression that sent chills down my spine. "We haven't forgotten about you, darling. We know how much you love your work, so we thought we'd give you something practical." She slid a manila envelope across the desk toward me, her manicured nails tapping against the edge as she waited for me to open it. With a growing sense of dread, I unfolded the papers inside, scanning the legal jargon until my eyes landed on the property description. My stomach dropped. A parking lot. Not even a valuable one. Not even a prime piece of land with potential. It was an empty, deteriorating lot on the outskirts of town, a place so rundown that even the weeds had started giving up on growing through the cracks. I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I looked back up at them. "You can't be serious," I said, the words barely more than a whisper. "Of course we're serious," my father replied, looking slightly irritated by my reaction. "It's an investment opportunity, Rebecca. You're always talking about real estate. Consider this a project." A project? That's what they called it. A project for me to waste my time on while Olivia basked in the wealth and luxury of a fully furnished estate, complete with the family fortune to ensure she never had to lift a finger. I could have fought. I could have screamed. I could have thrown every piece of paper in that study into the air and told them exactly what I thought of their so-called generosity. But instead, I did the one thing they never expected. I smiled. Because at that moment, something shifted inside me. A realization settled over me like the cool clarity of a storm breaking apart the sky. If they wanted to erase me, if they wanted to push me into the shadows while Olivia took center stage, then fine. I would let them believe they had won. But I had built myself up from nothing before, and I could do it again. Only this time, I would make sure they regretted every single choice they had made. I stood in that study with my parents and Olivia, the weight of the so-called gift they had handed me pressing against my ribs like an iron cage. They had expected outrage, a dramatic display of emotions, perhaps even desperate pleading for something, anything better than the cracked pavement and faded white lines of an abandoned parking lot. They thought they had secured Olivia's future while tossing me a burden disguised as an opportunity, assuming I would either accept my fate in silent defeat or beg them to reconsider their decision. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't the warm, grateful smile of a daughter who had just been handed a future filled with boundless opportunities. It wasn't the polite, restrained smile of someone trying to mask disappointment with forced gratitude. No, this smile was something sharper, something colder, something that sent a flicker of uncertainty across my mother's otherwise poised face. "Thank you," I said, setting the property deed back down on the polished mahogany desk with careful precision. "This is exactly what I need." My father let out an approving grunt, leaning back in his chair with an air of self-satisfaction, completely oblivious to the storm brewing behind my calm expression. My mother studied me for a moment longer, her fingers tightening slightly around the pearls draped around her neck, as if sensing, just for a moment, that something was amiss. Olivia, however, looked downright smug, the corners of her lips twitching with poorly concealed delight at what she believed was my misfortune. "Well, I'm glad to see you're taking this so well," my mother said, her voice carefully measured, her eyes still searching for a crack in my demeanor. "We thought you'd appreciate the independence this gives you." I nodded, tapping my fingers against the edge of the deed with an almost lazy rhythm. "I do," I replied smoothly, tilting my head just slightly, letting my gaze linger on Olivia for half a second longer than necessary. "In fact, I have some ideas already." That was all it took for a flicker of unease to pass through Olivia's eyes, just a flash of something uncertain before she smothered it beneath another layer of condescension. She had always been the golden child, the one showered in praise and handed every opportunity on a silver platter. But she had never been particularly intelligent, not in the way that mattered. She was excellent at mimicking charm, at coasting on carefully curated perfection, but she had never once had to fight for something, to claw her way up from nothing, to build something from the ground up with nothing but sheer willpower. And that was the difference between us. I left the estate that night with a single goal in mind. If they wanted to hand Olivia the mansion, if they wanted to believe they had secured her future while tossing me aside like an afterthought, then fine. Let them believe they had already won. Let them bask in their own arrogance while I turned their so-called punishment into something they could never have imagined. I drove straight to the parking lot that now bore my name on a deed, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel as I parked in the center of the empty space. The lot was exactly as I had remembered, neglected, forgotten, nothing more than a stretch of cracked pavement that no one paid attention to unless they were looking for a shortcut to somewhere better. I stepped out of my car, the summer heat radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves, the air thick with the scent of distant gasoline and baked concrete. I turned in a slow circle, taking in every faded parking space, every weed pushing stubbornly through the cracks, every detail that had made my parents believe they were condemning me to irrelevance. But what they had failed to consider, what they had never even thought to ask, was that I had spent years studying real estate. While Olivia had been flitting from one failed business venture to another, burning through my parents' wealth like it was an infinite resource, I had been learning. I had been watching. I had been investing in my future long before they had ever decided to dictate it for me. This lot was not a death sentence. It was an opening move. By the time I returned home that night, my mind was already working through the numbers, flipping through property records, scanning city zoning regulations. I stayed up for hours, poring over every document I could find, mapping out every possible outcome, every potential investment opportunity, every loophole my parents had been too short-sighted to notice. The next morning, I made my first call. "I need a property appraisal," I told the voice on the other end of the line, my tone crisp, professional. "And I need it done as soon as possible." By the end of the week, I had every piece of information I needed. The lot was undervalued, grossly undervalued. My parents had probably assumed it was worthless or, at the very least, a low-return investment that would keep me occupied without ever actually yielding any real success. What they hadn't considered was its location, just close enough to the city's rapidly expanding commercial district to make it valuable, just overlooked enough that no one had bothered to fight for it yet. They had handed me what they believed was an insult. I was about to turn it into an empire. A month passed, and I made my first major move. I filed for a business permit. Not a real estate sale. Not a desperate attempt to trade the lot for something better. No, I was going to develop it myself. 2 months in, I secured my first investor. By the third month, I had a full development plan in place, a high-end urban space designed for pop-up businesses, rotating vendors, and a modernized outdoor marketplace. It was a concept that had already been thriving in major metropolitan areas, and I had the data to prove it. More importantly, I had something Olivia never had, an actual plan. I waited until the project was fully in motion before making my next move. I went back to the estate. I walked through the grand iron gates, past the pristine hedges and the sprawling driveway, past the staff that had known me since childhood but no longer looked at me as though I belonged. Olivia greeted me at the front steps, a glass of champagne in one perfectly manicured hand, her expression laced with barely restrained amusement. "Rebecca," she purred, tilting her head as she scanned my simple blouse and blazer, her gaze dripping with judgment. "I was wondering how long it would take before you came crawling back." I smiled, slow and deliberate, taking a single step closer. "Oh, Olivia," I murmured, reaching into my bag and pulling out the property valuation report, handing it to her with a casual flick of my wrist. I didn't come back to beg. I watched as she scanned the numbers, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion to something dangerously close to panic. "I came back to let you know," I said, my voice light, my smile unwavering, "that you just made the worst mistake of your life." Olivia's eyes narrowed as she handed the property valuation report back to me, but the sense of triumph that surged through me was palpable. For the first time in years, I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. Olivia might have thought her golden girl status would protect her, but she had no idea just how far I had come in the past few months. What I had built on that neglected parking lot was far more than any mansion or family estate could ever offer. Her grip on her champagne flute tightened, her perfectly painted lips parting slightly as if she were struggling to process the figures on the paper. You actually think you can do something with that?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "You're going to turn a parking lot into some sort of trendy marketplace?" I smiled sweetly, watching her disbelieving expression turn to one of barely concealed frustration. She had never understood business in any meaningful way, and the thought that I could turn this unremarkable lot into a success was nothing more than a bitter pill she wasn't willing to swallow. Not just a marketplace, Olivia, I replied calmly, folding the report back into my bag. A thriving hub. A place where people can come to work, shop, and create something real. Something your mansion will never be. Her nostrils flared as she stifled an angry retort, but before she could speak, I turned on my heel and walked back toward the gate. I knew this moment would shake her, though she wouldn't admit it. It wasn't the thought of my success that bothered her, it was the fact that I had finally found a way to rise above her and my parents' expectations. It was the fact that I had proven, in the most significant way possible, that I could build something they could never have imagined. Over the next few weeks, the reality of my success began to set in. My business venture moved quickly. The lot was cleared, and construction began almost immediately. It wasn't the glamorous, grand project my parents had envisioned for Olivia's inheritance, but it was sustainable. The first phase of development, an open-air marketplace for small business owners, was complete just as summer came to a close. The moment we opened our doors, I knew I had done something monumental. The influx of local vendors and entrepreneurs gave the project an energy I had hoped for but had never truly anticipated. People were excited, eager to be a part of something new and unique. They weren't just investing their money, they were investing in the community, in each other. The lot, once an eyesore, was now a buzzing center of commerce, art, and opportunity. It was alive with potential, with creativity. It was exactly what my parents had never seen coming. Despite my success, I couldn't ignore the growing tension between me and Olivia. She still hadn't quite grasped the magnitude of what I had done, and every time we spoke, she veiled her jealousy in sarcastic remarks and passive-aggressive comments. She tried to remain at the center of family gatherings, casually mentioning how much better things were in her mansion, but I could see through her facade. She couldn't stand the fact that, after all these years, I had finally taken control of my own future. One evening, as I reviewed new lease agreements at my desk, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from my mother. I stared at the screen for a moment, my pulse quickening as I considered ignoring it. But then I reminded myself that now, more than ever, I had to face them. "Hello?" I answered, my voice neutral. "Rebecca." My mother's voice came through, tight with something I couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." I resisted the urge to sigh. "About what?" "About your project," she replied, her tone clipped. "You know, your thriving hub in that parking lot. We've heard a lot about it, and frankly, we don't understand why you've chosen to compete with Olivia like this. We're a family, Rebecca. You should be helping her, not trying to overshadow her success." I almost laughed. The irony was too much to bear. "You're asking me to help Olivia? After everything you've done to me? After what you gave her and gave me nothing?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when my mother finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost pleading. "Rebecca, we didn't mean it like that. We just thought." "Thought what, Mother?" I interrupted, my voice more cutting than I had intended. "That I would just roll over and accept your crumbs while Olivia gets everything handed to her? Well, you're wrong. I'm not like her, and I'm certainly not going to sit quietly while you build her life on the foundation of my sacrifices." "Rebecca, you're being unreasonable," she said, exasperation creeping into her voice. "This isn't about Olivia's mansion or her success. It's about family. You need to stop fighting us." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "I'm not fighting you. I'm building something you never thought I could." There was a long silence before my mother finally responded. "You'll never understand the damage you're doing to this family. Your father and I have worked hard to give Olivia a life that reflects everything we've built. And now you come along, trying to tear that down." I closed my eyes, willing myself not to react. "I'm not tearing anything down. I'm building something of my own. And for the record, I'm not interested in your approval anymore." My mother's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible. "Don't come crawling back when it all falls apart." I ended the call without a word. The familiar weight of resentment settled over me, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt freeing. For so long, I had been chasing their approval, trying to prove my worth, trying to make them see me as something other than the afterthought of the family. But now, I no longer cared what they thought. The next morning, I woke to a series of missed calls from Olivia. She had finally decided to reach out after weeks of passive-aggressive comments. Her voice was icy when I answered, the words she spoke sharp and calculated. "You really think this little project of yours will save you, Rebecca?" she sneered. "You really think people will remember you for this parking lot you turned into a thriving hub?" I almost smiled at her tone, knowing that beneath the surface of her condescending words, she was scared. She was scared because she knew exactly what I was capable of, and deep down, she feared that my success would eclipse hers. "I don't need people to remember me, Olivia," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not here for their approval. I'm here because I know what I'm capable of, and you should too." She was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was a slight crack in her voice. "You're making a mistake. The family will never support you. You'll be on your own, just like you always have been." I shook my head, a smile tugging at my lips. Maybe that's what I've always needed, to be on my own. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only way I'll ever truly succeed. I hung up before she could say anything else, her words ringing in my ears. But this time, they didn't bother me. Olivia didn't get it, and my parents would never understand. But I had finally realized something important. I didn't need them to. What they had once seen as my failure was now the foundation of my success. And I would never let them take that away from me. The first sign that Olivia was beginning to feel the pressure came in the form of a hastily planned family gathering at the mansion. I received the invitation via a formal email sent by her assistant, a woman I had never met, but who apparently handled all of Olivia's social engagements as if she were managing a royal court. The message was polite, almost sterile, with no indication of the growing tension that had simmered beneath the surface of our last conversation. At first, I debated ignoring it entirely, refusing to subject myself to another evening of subtle jabs and carefully curated passive-aggressive remarks. But then I thought about my mother's warning that I would come crawling back when everything fell apart. I thought about Olivia's thinly veiled threats, the way she tried to diminish everything I had built, as if her words alone could undo months of my hard work. If they wanted a performance, then I would give them one. The night of the gathering, I arrived at the estate dressed in a sleek, tailored black jumpsuit that made me feel untouchable. I wasn't here to impress them, but I also wasn't going to walk into that house looking anything less than formidable. If Olivia thought she could parade me around as some failed, floundering sister struggling to make sense of her so-called bad luck, she was about to be gravely disappointed. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the weight of expectation pressing against me like a thick, suffocating fog. The chandeliers sparkled above a sea of guests, most of whom had been regulars at my parents' lavish events for years, family friends, old business partners, distant relatives who had long since chosen sides in the unspoken hierarchy of favoritism. Olivia spotted me almost immediately, her lips curving into what I assumed was meant to be a gracious smile but instead looked forced, brittle, barely holding itself together. "Rebecca," she greeted, sweeping toward me with a glass of champagne in hand, her voice saccharine sweet. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I met her gaze, tilting my head slightly as I accepted a glass from a passing server. Why wouldn't I? It's always fascinating to see how royalty entertains. Her smile faltered just for a second, the muscles in her jaw tightening before she quickly smoothed her expression into something more polished. "Oh, come now," she said lightly, looping her arm through mine as if we were the closest of sisters. "We're celebrating tonight. No need for your usual cynicism." I let her guide me through the room, my eyes scanning the crowd, catching glimpses of familiar faces, our parents, of course, stationed near the grand piano, chatting with their usual circle of influential friends. There was a sense of detachment in their posture, as if they were deliberately avoiding looking in my direction, choosing instead to focus on the security they had built around Olivia. As the night wore on, I noticed something peculiar. Olivia was trying too hard. Her laughter was a little too loud, her gestures a little too exaggerated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was waiting for someone to confirm something she wasn't entirely sure of herself. It wasn't the composed, effortless charm she usually exuded at these events. It was something closer to desperation. And then I heard the whispers. Two women stood near the dessert table, their voices hushed, but just loud enough for me to catch snippets of their conversation. Already behind on some of the property taxes. Can you believe it? With everything her parents gave her? Heard she tried to get a second loan on the estate, but the bank is hesitating. Something about financial instability. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the realization settle over me like a tide creeping onto the shore. Olivia was in trouble. She had been given everything, a mansion, a trust fund, a future built on the foundation of our parents' wealth, and yet, somehow, she was still managing to fall apart. It would have been easy to gloat, to relish in the irony of it all, but instead, I felt something else entirely. Not sympathy. Not even satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding of the inevitable truth. Olivia had never known how to stand on her own. She had been handed the keys to a kingdom she didn't know how to rule, and now, as the weight of responsibility pressed down on her, the cracks in her carefully curated life were beginning to show. I waited until later in the evening, after the guests had thinned and the air in the mansion had shifted into something more subdued, before approaching her. She stood on the balcony overlooking the garden, her shoulders tense as she stared out into the night, the illusion of effortless perfection finally beginning to slip away. Must be exhausting, I said, stepping beside her, resting my glass on the stone railing. She exhaled sharply, not bothering to feign ignorance. What do you want, Rebecca? I studied her for a moment, the way her fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute, the slight tremor in her grip betraying the mask she was still trying to wear. You're struggling, I said simply, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. And I suppose you're just waiting for me to fail completely, aren't you? You'd love that. I tilted my head slightly, considering my next words carefully. I don't need to wait for anything, Olivia. You've already done this to yourself. Her jaw tightened, her knuckles turning white against the glass. You think you're so much better than me because you turned a parking lot into a business. But let's be real, Rebecca. You're just the backup plan, the extra. You always have been. I smiled, not out of malice, but because I had finally accepted something she never would. Her words didn't matter anymore. Maybe I was, I admitted, turning to face her fully. But look at us now, Olivia. You have everything they gave you, and somehow you're still losing. I had nothing, and I built something for myself. And that is the difference between us. She opened her mouth to retort, but for the first time in our lives, she had nothing left to say. I picked up my glass, raising it slightly before taking one last sip. Good luck with the mansion, Olivia, I murmured, my voice soft but firm. I have a feeling you're going to need it. And with that, I turned and walked away, the weight of their expectations finally lifting from my shoulders. Because this time, I was the one leaving them behind. The moment I walked away from Olivia on that balcony, I knew that the end of her charade was closer than even she realized. She had spent her entire life basking in the safety net our parents had woven so tightly around her, never once imagining that she might have to stand on her own. But now, as the whispers of financial instability spread through the social circles she so desperately clung to, I knew that the reality she had ignored for so long was finally closing in on her. I didn't need to wait for the official fallout. I could already see the signs. A week after the party, I received an unexpected email from a well-known investor who had originally passed on funding my project. He had been polite but dismissive in our first conversation, the kind of man who only backed ventures that already had a track record of financial success. But now his tone had shifted, his words careful, his interest suddenly piqued. Rebecca, I'd like to revisit our previous discussion. It seems your marketplace has garnered quite a bit of attention. Let's schedule a time to talk. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against the desk as I reread his words, my mind working through the implications. Investors were a cautious breed, always looking for signs of weakness in one place and strength in another. If he was circling back to me now, it could only mean one thing: he had sensed instability elsewhere. And I had a very strong suspicion of where that instability was coming from. By the time the news broke publicly, I was already 3 steps ahead. Olivia had defaulted on a major payment for the estate, a financial miscalculation that was no doubt exacerbated by her habit of spending without thinking. My parents, who had once been the ever-present safety net beneath her feet, had been forced to cover for her, at least temporarily. But even their patience had limits. I wasn't there when the argument happened, but I heard about it through the ever-reliable grapevine of mutual acquaintances. It had been an explosive fight, the kind that tore through the carefully constructed facade of our family like a wrecking ball. My father, furious at having to bail her out yet again, had made it clear that he was done covering for her mistakes. My mother, ever the loyal defender, had tried to smooth things over, but even she couldn't ignore the growing reality that Olivia was sinking faster than she could be rescued. The mansion, the one they had so proudly handed her, was now at risk. The news didn't surprise me. In fact, I had been waiting for it. I kept my distance for a while, focusing on my own work, expanding the reach of my marketplace, securing additional partnerships, and strengthening my growing influence in the local business community. The more Olivia struggled, the more my success became undeniable, the contrast between us becoming clearer with every passing day. But then, one evening, as I was closing up the office, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Olivia. For a long moment, I debated whether or not to answer. She had spent so much time dismissing me, belittling my accomplishments, pretending that my success was nothing more than a temporary stroke of luck. But now, she was calling me. And I had a very good idea why. Curiosity won out. I answered. "Rebecca," she said, and for the first time in my life, there was no arrogance in her voice. Just exhaustion. Just uncertainty. I leaned against my desk, glancing out the window at the bustling marketplace I had built from the ground up. "Olivia," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "This is a surprise." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Then, finally, she exhaled, the weight of whatever she had been holding and finally slipping into her voice. "I need your help." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in, letting the irony of it settle into my bones. The same sister who had once mocked me for turning a parking lot into a business was now asking me for help. And despite everything, despite all the years of resentment, part of me still wanted to know why. "What happened?" I asked, though I already knew. She hesitated, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, stripped of all its usual bravado. "The mansion is at risk. I made a mistake. I thought I could handle the finances, but She stopped, her breath hitching slightly. "I overestimated myself." I waited, giving her the space to say what she needed to say. "My investors pulled out of my latest project," she admitted, her words halting, reluctant. "The bank won't extend another loan, and our parents," she let out a bitter laugh. "Let's just say they're not as eager to fix my mistakes anymore." I didn't respond right away. I wanted her to sit with the silence, to feel the weight of her words, to understand that she was finally in a position she had never expected to be in. Vulnerable. Exposed. Alone. "You need money," I said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. She didn't argue. "I need advice," she corrected, though we both knew that wasn't the full truth. "You're good at this, Rebecca. You always have been. You see things other people don't." I don't know what to do." For a moment, I let myself wonder how different things could have been if Olivia had recognized this sooner. If she had ever seen me as an equal instead of as an afterthought. "You want me to fix what you broke," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any emotion. She inhaled sharply, as if my words had physically struck her. She hesitated. "I don't want to lose everything." And there it was. Not an apology. Not an admission that she had been wrong about me. Just fear. Fear of losing the life she had always assumed would be hers. I could have helped her. I had the knowledge, the experience, the connections. I knew exactly what steps she needed to take to salvage the situation before it was too late. But I also knew that some lessons couldn't be taught with words. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. "You'll figure it out," I said finally, my voice even, my decision clear. "Rebecca, wait. I have to go, Olivia," I interrupted, reaching for my keys, already moving toward the door. "I have my own business to run." And this time, I ended the call before she could say another word. When I ended the call with Olivia, I felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over me, as if a weight I had carried for years had finally been lifted. She had always believed that she would never need me, that she would never have to ask for my help, that she would always be the one looking down from above while I remained beneath her shadow. But now, the roles had shifted, and she was the one reaching for a lifeline while I stood firmly on solid ground. I didn't feel guilty for refusing to help her. I didn't feel vindictive or cruel or triumphant. I just felt done. For so long, I had wanted recognition, validation, some kind of acknowledgement from my family that I had value beyond being the afterthought. I had spent years trying to prove myself to parents who had already made up their minds, to a sister who had always been given everything without ever having to earn it. But in the end, none of that mattered. My success had never depended on their approval, it had only depended on me. The days passed and Olivia didn't call again. I expected her to, thought she might at least make one last attempt to appeal to my emotions, but the silence stretched between us like an invisible chasm neither of us was willing to cross. Instead, I heard about her downfall from other people. The first crack in her foundation came when the rumors about her financial troubles reached the ears of the wrong people. Investors, socialites, and business associates who had once fawned over her began pulling away, distancing themselves from her in the way that wealthy people always did when they sensed instability. The invitations stopped coming. The calls from friends grew fewer and farther between. The people who had once adored her began whispering about her behind closed doors, speculating about just how much she had lost and how much further she had to fall. Then, the second crack appeared at the mansion. It had been inevitable, really. She had defaulted on her payments, and without a financial safety net to catch her, the bank had moved quickly. The estate that had been gifted to her, the home she had paraded as proof of her superiority, was now slipping through her fingers. The final crack, the one that shattered everything, came from our parents. They had done everything for Olivia, had shaped their entire world around ensuring her comfort, her success, her unchallenged reign over the family's wealth. But when they realized they could no longer protect her from the consequences of her own choices, they did what they had never done before. They let her fall. It wasn't out of cruelty. It wasn't even out of disappointment. It was out of necessity. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that my father had been the one to deliver the final blow, his voice cold and distant as he told her that there would be no more money, no more bailouts, no more last-minute rescues. My mother had been softer, but the message had been the same. She had made this mess, and she would have to clean it up herself. When the foreclosure was finalized, I knew Olivia had reached the moment she had never believed would come. And then, finally, she called me. I stared at the screen, watching her name flash against the dark background of my phone, debating whether or not to answer. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her sit in the consequences of her own arrogance, to leave her with nothing but the silence she had once forced upon me. But another part of me, perhaps the last piece that still remembered what it was like to be her sister, picked up. There was no pretense this time. No forced charm. No feigned superiority. Just quiet resignation. "I lost the house," she said, and for the first time in our lives, she sounded small. "I know," I replied, because I did. Everyone did. There was a long pause, a silence that stretched between us like a final test, one last chance for her to prove she had learned something from all of this. "I didn't think it would end like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did I said honestly, because despite everything, despite the years of favoritism, despite the way she had always dismissed me, a part of me had still believed that she would find a way to survive. Another pause. Then, finally, she asked the question I had been expecting. "Rebecca," she said slowly, carefully. Do you think I could work with you? At the marketplace?" For a moment, I almost laughed. The idea of Olivia working for me, standing in the space she had once mocked, answering to the sister she had always believed was beneath her, it was almost too poetic. But I didn't laugh. Because I knew that if I did, if I let even a trace of mockery slip into my tone, she would retreat, and whatever small shred of humility she had gained would disappear. I sighed, leaning back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling as I considered my answer. "If you want to work for me, Olivia, then you're going to have to do it the same way everyone else does," I said, my voice even. No special treatment. No favors. No shortcuts. I could almost hear her swallow on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said softly. "I understand." And maybe, for the first time, she actually did. I didn't offer her a position that day. I didn't give her an easy way out. But I also didn't shut the door completely. If she truly wanted to learn, if she truly wanted to rebuild herself from the ground up, then she would have to prove it, not just to me, but to herself. When I hung up, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no victory. Just peace. Because this was never about revenge. This was about proving to myself that I had always been capable, that I had always been strong enough to build something of my own. And I had. I had taken the thing they had meant as an insult, the thing they had given me as a consolation prize, and I had turned it into something greater than any mansion or family legacy could ever be. I had built my own future, and I no longer needed them to see it to know that it was real.